The child slid across the dock on raw rope and splintered wood while a bailiff's boot struck a coil of wet line. The narrator watched from the raised bench, ledger open, and recorded the moment without pause. Suspicion governed the narrator's pen. He suspected the law had bent to spectacle, and that suspicion shaped every selection of which facts he wrote and which he left to ink's margin. The magistrate cleared his throat and read the charge aloud with the cadence of an oath, his signet ring flashing when he tapped the parchment. The immediate conflict was visible, a municipal court treating a boy's theft or mischief as a public example. The crowd pressed close against railings, dogs huddled beneath benches, the dock smelled of fish brine and candle wax. The narrator noted the child's age from the clerk's handwriting, 12, and wrote it in a steady hand. He also wrote the child's name when the mother stepped forward and said it in a voice that broke once. The narrator did not interrupt that exchange. He recorded what was said. The magistrate said, "This court recognizes no concession for years when guilt is proven." The narrator wrote the sentence. The mother said, "Please, magistrate, he is only Jonas. He is a child." The bailiff gripped Jonah's forearm and tightened the rope. The witness said, "I saw him take the ledger strip from my stall." The narrator watched how the magistrate's eyes moved from the witness to the child and back, counting each reaction as evidence. Within the first minutes, the chapter's core problem was clear. Municipal procedure set a young body equal to an adult defendant. The narrator's investigation would be to show, with recorded steps, how that translation from misdemeanor to corporal penalty happened. He wanted the ledger to show sequence, motive, and consequence. He wanted the town to be able to read the same sequence years later and find the same mechanics of law and spectacle. The dock courtroom was a raised platform bolted to the quay, a rectangular slab of oak planks ringed by low railings. A single iron lantern burned beside the magistrate. Candles were set on a clerk's table. The narrator noted the placement of objects only when they altered the trial. The clerk's sealed pouch, the bailiff's iron chain, the toy among the exhibits. He wrote precise details rather than impressions. The recorder's duty was to deliver facts that could be checked against skin and wood. Magistrate Rook sat behind a small lectern. He had a worn gold braid along his robe and ink-stained fingertips. He pronounced legal doctrines in the voice of municipal order. Law holds the social body intact, Magistrate Rook, and the body of disruption will be punished to dissuade others. He tapped the seal. The narrator recorded the exact phrase and the way the crowd inhaled at the word punished. The clerk, named Perrin, unrolled a sealed packet and laid a strip of parchment on the table. Perrin's hands were steady, his face was tight. "Perrin, here are the sworn complaints and the artisan's note." A townsman in the gallery spat and muttered. The narrator wrote the words on his ledger, then looked for contradiction or corroboration. He noticed a child's wooden charm slip from Jonas's tunic and fall to the plank. The charm landed near a boot and did not move. Bailiff Crane tightened iron restraints around Jonah's wrists at the magistrate's direction. Crane's palms were gloved, and the metal bit into small skin. Jonas did not scream at first. He breathed through his teeth and pressed his lips together. The narrator described the tightening as a procedural act. The court announced the measure as necessary to prevent flight, but the action also turned the boy's body into evidence in the eyes of the crowd. A witness emerged from the second row, Marta of the fish market, known to the town for blunt speech. Marta pointed at Jonas and said, "He snatched my ledger strip and ran past the vendor's stall at noon." The narrator noted Marta's cadence and the way the magistrate leaned forward at the word noon. The mother, Anna, called out, "Marta, you know the street. You saw others." Her voice cut off when a man in the gallery hissed condemnation. Doubt surfaced in the room when Perrin retrieved a child's toy from the evidence table and set it on the bench for inspection. The toy was a carved wooden dog, its paint rubbed thin. The toy belonged to Jonas, and someone had placed a notch in its ear with a tidy blade. A murmur spread. Magistrate Rook's jaw tightened. He signaled Perrin to keep proceedings. The narrator's suspicion shifted. Doubt had become pressure that might force the court to bend its ritual or to double down. Magistrate Rook addressed the crowd. "Order," he said. "We will proceed with interrogation." He turned to Jonas. "State your name." Jonas' voice came as a thin, frightened sound. "Jonas," he said. "Jonas Merritt." The narrator recorded the name and the pitch change on the boy's last syllable. Jonas folded his hands against his chest and kept his eyes low. The interrogation unfolded as ritual rather than conversation. A bailiff guided Jonas to a small bench beside a lamp. The narrator noted that the bench was positioned so the magistrate could observe the child's face and the gallery could see him. The bailiff tightened a strap that pulled Jonas' arms forward. The witness martyr described the theft in precise movements, pointing to a time and a place and listing people she had seen. He passed the stall and dropped the strip into his sleeve. "Martyr, I saw him drop it and then dash behind the curtain of barrels." The clerk Pirin produced a merchant's ledger with a torn strip that matched Martyr's description. As the interrogation went on, the narrator tracked how the magistrate's technique changed. He recorded speech pauses, the magistrate's slow hand taps, the use of a sealed document to present a presumption as truth. "We proceed by oath, Magistrate Rook. If the accused will not confess, we will test the truth with restraint." The bailiff produced iron bracelets and a small wooden device with metal pins. The narrator wrote the object down in precise terms. An iron cuff, a snapping latch, a wooden post with carved notches, and a pad of lead used to mark points of pressure. He refused to call the device by a name that might soften or sensationalize it. Emotion shifted again in the room when the mother, Anna, stepped into the small space and tried to speak. "Magistrate, he is only Jonas. He belongs home. Let him have counsel." Her words came in short bursts. She put her hand to the child's shoulder and found only a shuddering smallness beneath her palm. She turned to Pirin and said, "Pirin, the ledger strip could have been planted." Pirin folded his hands and said, "Madam, I recorded the strip as matching the merchant's account." The exchange became a short argument. "Anna, Magistrate Rook, the law must be seen to act." Anna's hand shook. Jonas squeezed her fingers and whispered, "Mother, please." Jonas's voice was a light sound that did not carry. The narrator wrote the whisper, because the whisper was recorded in the clerk's notes as well. The narrator then wrote the magistrate's decision to formalize restraint and continue interrogation under pressure. The bailiff applied the cuffs and secured Jonas to the wooden post at the rear of the dock, where the magistrate kept instruments. The wood creaked under Jonas's weight. The narrator watched the child's knuckles whiten. The crowd fell into a quieter silence, not comfortable but watchful. The narrator's suspicion hardened into a claim. The court used physical restraint not only to prevent escape, but to produce compliance. During the next exchange, a twist appeared. A man at the edge of the gallery, Thomas Hearn, a journeyman weaver, stepped forward and said he had seen another youth run that day, someone wearing another tunic. He named a time and gave a specific alleyway between the tannery and the cooper. Magistrate Rook frowned and asked Hearn to state what he saw. Hearn, not sure of the face, "But I remember the coat. It was green with a tear at the cuff." Pirin compared the merchant's ledger entry with Hearn's description and murmured that the strip matched a different merchant's record. For a thin moment the court wavered. That moment held the chapter's mid-cliffhanger. The gallery leaned in. Anna moved her hand upward in hope. Magistrate Rook closed his eyes for a breath and then reopened them. He commanded, "Bring the proofs forward." The bailiff rummaged in the evidence chest and produced a sealed complaint that linked Jonas to the strip. The narrator noted the sequence. Hearn's testimony introduced reasonable doubt. The sealed complaint reasserted institutional proof. The court, not yet a neutral arbiter, chose the sealed proof over the witness' uncertainty. The clerk Pirin read a passage from the municipal code regarding juveniles and public order. He read the exact phrasing used to justify equal culpability. If a minor acts in a manner that disrupts peace, the law treats that action as deliberate when the community's safety is at stake. Magistrate Rook then declared that an example must be set. This community owes safety a visible demonstration." The narrator recorded the phrase and the way the crowd shifted. Some nodded, others turned away. As the magistrate prepared the stamped verdict, He performed rituals that reassured his authority. He folded parchment, struck wax, and pressed the signet. Each motion was small but deliberate. He moved with the slow precision of an official who had given this form of pen and seal more weight than any single human voice. Perrin stamped the verdict and slid it across. The narrator recorded the stamp's impression and the time. The magistrate pronounced sentence aloud. Corporal chastisement to be administered at the dock's rear. We order measured corrections, he said. Measured corrections will deter further thefts. The narrator wrote the sentence and added the descriptive fact that the bailiff dragged a cloth-wrapped device from beneath the bench. The cloth left a line of dust on the planks. Jonas stared at the device and his breath hitched. Bailiff Crane moved to secure Jonas to the device. Magistrate Rook surveyed the crowd for effect, then said, "We apply restraint and correction now." The device's metal caught the lantern light. The iron looked cold. The bailiff tightened a strap that fastened Jonas' small hands. The narration here slows in detail for proof. The strap buckled at the third hole. The latch clicked at a measured pace. The child's shoulders moved against the constraints. The narrator noted the sound of metal and the grunt Jonas made when the strap pulled tight. A secondary twist reached into the gallery. One of the townsfolk, a shoemaker named Elias, stood and said, "Magistrate, if you punish Jonas now, I will no longer sell leather to your household." He set his jaw and placed his palm on his breast. Magistrate Rook paused, then smiled in a way that resembled containment rather than concession. "Elias," the magistrate said, "your trades matter, but order matters more." Elias sat down and thumped his foot against the bench. The narrator wrote Elias's stance as a fact. City commerce resisted spectacle only until the magistrate reasserted the narrative of necessity. The verbal friction escalated into a brief argument of 3 rapid exchanges. "Magistrate," the boy smother pleds. Anna, pleas are not laws." Magistrate Rook replied, "This is not mercy, this is method." Perrin. A townsman barked, "Let him feel what stealing brings." The narrator recorded these lines without comment, each line folded into the official transcript. The bailiff adjusted the device and turned a small crank that pressed a blunt pad into Jonas' palm. The narrator wrote the mechanical details. A barrel cam converted rotation into linear pressure. A wedge tightened a brace under the child's wrist. The child's skin reddened where metal met flesh. Jonas inhaled sharply and tried to pull free. "Please, I didn't." Magistrate Rook cut him off with a single statement. "Confession or correction will end this quickly." The narrator observed that the magistrate equated speed with justice. Jonas' body reacted concretely to the pressure. He clenched his jaw, his fingers flexed beneath leather straps, and vomit rose in his throat. The narrator did not moralize. He listed the bodily reactions as evidence of coercion. Angeled by the magistrate's insistence, the witness martyr moved closer and repeated her allegation in staccato words. Yet Hearn's earlier testimony had seeded doubt. That doubt returned now as a small, persistent prick in the magistrate's composure. At that instant, a sudden reveal changed the court's picture. Perrin's ledger, when flipped, showed an annotation. Another merchant's tally indicated that a different boy had been paid for work and had access to the stolen strip. The annotation bore a clerk's shorthand and a smear of red ink. Perrin looked at the smear and at his palm, then at the magistrate. "This mark was made when I counted receipts at dusk. The tally here marks payment to a different alley's youth." Perrin. The narrator recorded the line and noted the exact location of the ink. The gallery murmured. A concrete piece of evidence contradicted the initial complaint. Magistrate Rook drew a deeper line across the ledger's margin and said, "Even if others touched the strip, Jonas had the item on him at the time of arrest." He leaned forward and folded his hands. "Our law weighs presence and community safety over private intent." The narrator wrote the magistrate's words down and observed the tactic. When factual cracks appeared, the court appealed to principle and spectacle. The climax occurred when the magistrate ordered immediate corporal correction and commanded the bailiff to begin. The bailiff operated the crank and the strap tightened around Jonas' hands. Jonas screamed. It was not a high, theatrical cry. It was a raw sound emitted when the body surpasses what it can endure. The crowd flinched. Magistrate Rook held his face still. The narrator recorded the scream as a time-stamped fact, and then catalogued the subsequent physical effects. Jonah's breathing ragged, his fingers numb, his eyes watering. After the device had been applied and Jonah's had been released, the bailiff carried him by the shoulder toward a waiting cart. The child's wooden charm lay where it had fallen, slightly scuffed and still. The narrator closed his ledger and made an entry: verdict executed. Corrective chastisement inflicted. Defendant removed. He noted the time and the names. He noted too that the crowd dispersed with uneven steps. Some heads bowed, some faces flushed with approval. In the final scene on the dock steps, Anna picked up the child's charm with hands that trembled visibly. She pressed it against her chest and said, "Take care, Jonas." Jonas did not answer aloud. He only blinked and watched the bench where the magistrate had been. The narrator recorded the action of the charm being taken and the placement of Jonas into the cart. The magistrate secured his robe, turned to Perrin and said, "Make a note of the effect." Perrin nodded and sealed the entry. The narrator logged the seal and the magistrate's final gesture as discrete facts. The chapter ended with a cold ledger entry and a concrete remnant on the dock. The scuffed wooden charm beside a smear of candle wax. The narrator wrote the last line as he always did: name, offense, sentence, time, and executor. The record concluded the mini-conflict. The court had chosen enforcement over further inquiry. The child had been taken, and the town would now bear the memory in practical, material ways. No moral conclusion followed in the writing. Only a final notation and the image of a small charm under the lantern's dim glow. Emotion shifts threaded the chapter. Suspicion that law would be bent, doubt when an alternative witness spoke, pressure when the magistrate reasserted authority, outrage when the device was applied. Resignation as the crowd dispersed, those shifts appeared in actions. The narrator's pen hesitated, Anna's hand trembled, Magistrate Rook's jaw tightened, Perrin's voice steadied. The chapter closed on a situational beat, the child placed in a cart and the magistrate stamping another day's order, so the record could serve its purpose. To show the mechanics by which innocence is transformed into public evidence and to mark who made that choice. Bailiffs seized the trembling child in the lane and did not pause when a woman called from a doorway. Suspicion guided the narrator's pen as he stepped down from the bench to watch the handover. He treated the transfer as an item of record rather than mercy. The lantern light cut the wet cobbles into bright lines, and the narrator noted the writ nailed to the lamp pole while his ledger stayed open. The core problem was visible. Municipal authority turned a boy into evidentiary weight. The narrator had seen a similar shape of procedure earlier at the docks 2 nights before, when the child slid across raw rope and splintered wood. That image was still in his ledger and shaped his attention now. He kept the ledger visible, fingers splayed on the margin, and recorded names, times, and the exact words the bailiffs used. Suspicion moved his choices. He looked for the ritual elements of prosecution, the exchange of papers, the prearranged gestures that substituted for judgment. They pushed the boy through the court door. The bailiff's hand on the child's shoulder left no room for bargaining. A clerk closed the heavy door and barred it with an iron pin. The narrator followed, ledger under his arm, and watched the room perform its mechanics. Stamps, seals, a chair pulled straight in front of a table. The narrator's attention remained outward, on sequence, on who touched what, on who watched, which would be his method for the rest of the night. A clerk spoke first, name, he asked, voice flat and practiced. The boy answered in a thin whisper, and the clerk repeated the charge aloud while the magistrate watched from his raised seat. The child did not raise his eyes. He folded his hands against his chest and pressed his fingers into the fabric of a torn sleeve. The narrator wrote each word down. The first emotion shift came as doubt. A clerk at the door, Matteo, moved differently than the others. He hesitated when the papers passed, and then slid a folded scrap toward the narrator under the ledger's edge. A note that claimed neighborhood testimony contradicted the complaint. The narrator's pen stopped. Doubt prickled along his fingertips, and he recorded the hesitation beside the clerk's name. The magistrate, seeing the interruption, made a slow motion to restore control. He adjusted his spectacles with an ink-stained finger and called the boy forward. "Kneel, Tumas," he commanded, using the surname from the writ. The boy obeyed. The magistrate's hands worked the parchment as if it were a ritual object. He read charges with a practiced cadence that converted rumor into statute. Magistrate: "You are accused of striking a widow's cart and of collecting refuse as a sign of association with thieves. What say you?" Young victim: "I didn't. I only picked up the mug, please, magistrate," answered the court. The boy's voice folded into silence. The magistrate's signature moved from skepticism to ritual certainty. The narrator writing the exchange felt his doubt shift into a second emotion shift. Fear. Not his own fear, but the fear that the procedure would harden into bodily harm. He could see the magistrate's posture tighten. He could see the bailiff reach for the iron cuff on the bench. A clerk named Elena stepped forward to empty the boy's pockets. She laid the broken toy, a carved wooden horse, and a small charm on the table. "Found these on him," she said. Her voice carried a concrete accusation. The magistrate tapped the charm with a ring and called it an amulet of mischief. "Magistrate, such things mark association. We catalogue contraband, Elena." "It is only a child's charm, Your Honor, magistrate." "This court will determine meaning." The narrator recorded their words, and the way Elena's fingers trembled when she touched the toy. He noted the bailiff, Serrano, who tightened his stance and rubbed his thumb across the iron cuff. Each gesture altered the room's balance. They led Thomas downstairs into the cellar. The stair was narrow and the cellar door slammed behind them. A lamp hung from an iron bracket and swung slightly as they moved. The narrator followed to the threshold and stopped, ledger open but hands steady. The cellar smelled of cold stone and old ropes. The bailiffs arranged the child on a bench and fetched a small iron restraint. The magistrate read a Puritan script about confession and the maintenance of order. The interrogation was a performance disguised as method. The magistrate asked questions in a circle: technique, motive, association. He outlined supposed evidence with the dry tone of an official reading a list. He sought a confession that would conform to the written charges, and his voice lacked warmth or curiosity. It carried only the authority of procedure. "Magistrate, tell us precisely who gave you the mug. Tell us who taught you to hide what you took." Young victim: I done know. I found it at the market. I gave it to my sister, magistrate." "You will name names," Elena murmured. "There are neighbors who swear they saw Thomas with the cart at dusk." Her words were small, but they set dominoes into motion. Matteo's earlier scrap sat on the narrator's lap like a second ledger entry, and the narrator felt the strain between what witnesses said and what the court needed. A clean confession. The ritual escalated. The bailiff tightened the small iron cuff around Thomas' wrist. Serrano clicked the mechanism and watched for the child's reaction. The cuff pressed against swollen skin and caused the boy to flinch. The narrator recorded the angle of pressure and the exact phrase the magistrate used when he declared the cuff a means to steady testimony. The magistrate spoke with a declarative calm that left no room for questions. Thomas swallowed air that smelled of oil and damp. He clenched his free hand until his knuckles whitened. The narrator described each muscle's twitch on his page. He avoided naming an internal sensation for Thomas and instead recorded the visible signs: a tightened jaw, a stuttered sentence, a tear that did not fall. A new event occurred. A neighbor named Rosa arrived and asked to speak. She stood in the doorway, panting from the stare, and handed the magistrate a scrap of testimony that contradicted the version used to justify restraint. Rosa, she saw the cart earlier with another boy, older and with a red scarf. Her presence forced a recalculation in the room. The narrator marked the arrival in the paper with a small dot. The room shifted. Matteo's note, Rosa's mouth, and Elena's trembling fingers became competing evidence. The magistrate's face narrowed. He breathed and then hardened the proceeding. He called for the restraints tightening to continue and told Serrano to make the child speak. The second emotion shift turned into a pressured resignation among those present. Matteo's doubt recoiled. Elena's pleading hardened into a professional steadiness. Rosa's urgency met institutional inertia. Magistrate, we are not here to be overturned by late witnesses. The order of the court must be preserved, Rosa. But I saw, Magistrate, you will give that to the clerk to include on record. For now, the sentence holds. The interrogation moved toward a narrow purpose: secure a confession that matched the charge. The magistrate read passages from municipal law that allowed coercion to ensure truth. The narrator recorded the quoted sections and the magistrate's page number. He underlined the lines about exemplary punishment and the town's interest in deterrence. Serrano tightened the cuff again, this time to a degree that forced Thomas to bite down on a stool. The child's voice broke into a high, raw sound that registered as a definite reaction in the room. Alina's breath left her. She pressed her hand into her apron and looked away. Rosa's fingers clenched the corners of her scrap. Matteo avoided the magistrate's eye. Thomas cried out, I didn't touch the cart, magistrate. Confess and you may receive lenience. Deny and the court will judge based on all testimony, Thomas. I gave the mug to Maria. She cried when she had to pawn it. She cried, Your Honor, magistrate. Who taught you then? Who led you to the cart? Thomas' answers grew shorter. The cuff's pressure and the repeated commands wore away at the edges of his resistance. The narrator kept his ledger open but found his handwriting slowing. He described the physical cause and effect rather than the child's interior collapse. He noted the sequence: pressure, inhalation, confession that could be read alongside the magistrate's page. A clerk's hand, the one who had slipped the scrap, trembled as he turned the pages to find Rosa's name in a docket. The clerk, Matteo said quietly, Your Honor, the witness claims another boy with a red scarf, magistrate. We will hear her complaint. This interrogation continues, Matteo persisted. If you will read the alley reports, you will see no sign of Thomas at earlier hours, magistrate. The law admits such statements, clerk, but it does not nullify the need for testimony here. Continue. Alina leaned toward the boy and asked a short, direct question. Who was with you? Young victim. No one. Only Maria Elena. Where is Maria now? Young victim. She trades at the market. She pawned it to pay the baker. Elena. Did anyone tell you to take it? Young victim. No, the dialogue ran in a tight exchange. The narrator preserved each short line and the names used. When Thomas Maria, the magistrate wrote the name into the docket and circled it. That act, circling, was physical and decisive. The magistrate's pen made a mark that would be used later in the ledger as proof. A twist arrived. Alina whispered to Matteo, loud enough for the narrator to catch, I saw the older boy with the scarf yesterday at dusk. He pushed Thomas toward the stall. Her voice was measured, and it introduced a fresh narrative that undermined the unfolding confession. The narrator felt a subtle surprise in the room. Rosa's presence had not been the only contradiction. Matteo, then why is Thomas in the dock? Elena, because when witnesses differ, the court expects a confession to reconcile them. That sentence exposed motive more clearly than any earlier statement. The court valued a tidy outcome. The magistrate's jaw tightened. He checked the docket, then ordered the clerk to remove the child's charm and place it with contraband. He declared, objects may speak. The phrasing reduced the toy to evidence in the eyes of the court. The climax, the beat marked as definitive, arrived when Serrano fully tightened the cuff and the magistrate pronounced the sentence that would send the child's testimony into written law. The cuff's pressure produced a sound, a dry, short intake from Thomas and a mutual silence in the cellar. The magistrate's hand moved to sign a sealed verdict. The narrator registered every micro-action. The scratch of pen, the click of seal, the small clink when the sealed verdict dropped into the docket box. Magistrate. We convict on the basis of confession and corroborative items. Record this as exemplary punishment, Serrano. The restraint is set. Thomas tried to cry but no sound came. His lips parted, and the magistrate read out the terms. A public mark labor assigned, a fine to be paid by a guardian if found. The narrator wrote each term and then closed his ledger with a pronounced motion that left an echo in the stone cell. After the sentence, scenes shifted toward aftermath. The magistrate ordered the toy placed in a sealed chest. Rosa pushed back against the decision, saying, This will not fix what I saw, Matteo, who had slipped the first scrap, asked the magistrate to review the alley watch. The magistrate declined, citing order. Elena stood with her hand over her mouth, her eyes wet but fixed on the bench. The narrator wrote the exchanges down, then recorded the placement of the toy under lock, the sound of the iron lid dropping, and the precise phrase the magistrate used to justify the choice. Order is more precious than uncertainty. The narrator left with his ledger closed but his attention unrelaxed. He walked past the dock where the child had slid on raw rope 2 nights earlier, the image folded into his notes like a cross-reference. He a bailiff as they passed. Will the child be presented at the market for the punishment? The bailiff answered with a practiced shrug and a phrase trained for many nights. He will be shown so others may learn. The narrator put the line into his ledger. The chapter's final concrete beat occurred on the cold stone staircase behind the court. Elena slipped a small scrap into the narrator's sleeve. An address where Maria might be found and a note that named the older boy with the red scarf as the likely perpetrator. The narrator felt the paper's grain and stored it away. That action closed the chapter's immediate conflict. The court had reached a verdict, but new evidence now existed in the narrator's pocket, and the toy sat under lock. The emotional aftertaste remained thin and metallic. The narrator did not reflect in broad phrases. He recorded actions that would matter later. He noted a child's toy placed in a chest, a sealed verdict, an address written in Matteo's hand, and rose a oath to return to the market the next dawn. The story ended not in a moral claim but in a set of physical facts that would be read by whatever tribunal came next. Inked pages, a sealed chest, and a folded scrap in a sleeve. The ledger closed with a final line. Thomas named the time, the punishment. The narrator clicked his spectacles up his nose and left the court, keeping the scrap pressed against his side. The narrator's suspicion had driven him to look, doubt had forced him to listen, and fear had made him write. The chapter concluded with a clear situational beat. Elena, the narrator, found Maria at the mill in the morning, and she stepped away, leaving the narrator to decide whether to follow the address or file the ledger first. He turned the scrap over in his fingers and walked down the lane toward the mill, the toy's absence like a missing object on the page. They dragged a bound 12-year-old onto the scaffold while the magistrate cleared his throat and began to read the charges aloud. Suspicion moved the narrator's pen before his eyes, a steady suspicion born of practice. He watched the magistrate's hands and the clerk's stamps as evidence rather than mercy. The marketplace hummed with merchants and gossip. The crowd pressed forward. The immediate problem was visible. Municipal law had chosen a child for an exemplary sentence by ritual intended to treat him like an adult criminal. The narrator had recorded other public punishments. He had seen the boy slide across the harbor ropes and splintered wood 2 chapters prior. He had watched bailiffs seize the child in the lane and carry him down to the cellar tribunal. He set down those memories as items of record and approached this scaffold with the same methodical caution. Suspicion guided him now. A mismatch in seals, a clerk's hesitation, a crowd's appetite for spectacle. He wrote with short strokes, eyes flicking from the child's wrists to the magistrate's face. The magistrate smoothed his robes and raised a folded parchment. By ordinance, the magistrate announced, "You are judged guilty." The voice was practiced. Magistrate's voice cut through shouts from the crowd. He read charges in language meant for adults. The magistrate pronounced theft, public disorder, and complicity in arson as if age were an irrelevant fact. Magistrate, the narrator wrote in the ledger margin over and over, like a stamp of witness. A woman pushed forward, chest heaving. She shouted, "My son." The witness mother reached the scaffold. Bailiff stepped between her and the judge. "Step back." A bailiff ordered, "Keep order." Another barked. The mother strained, fingers splayed, eyes fixed on the child's face. "Magistrate, please, he is 12, not a man." The magistrate did not look at her. He turned the parchment as if the words alone were proof. The narrator paused, pen hovering, and recorded the woman's name when a clerk whispered it to him. Anna Morales. He wrote Anna Morales beneath witness, because the ledger must hold who tried to intervene. Bailiffs produced iron cuffs and a wooden yoke. A clerk placed the instruments on the magistrate's bench like exhibit pieces. A bailiff took the child's wrists and spread them on the bench. The clerk picked up the iron cuffs. He ran his thumb along cold metal and placed them against the child's small forearm. The narrator noted the measurements. The iron rings were designed for adult wrists. The chain would bite into thinner skin. He wrote the degree of compression he expected. The child made a small sound, not yet a cry. "Clerk," the narrator said when the clerk stepped aside to show parchments. "Whose seal is that on the second mandate?" The clerk's fingers froze. He looked at the fold, then at the magistrate. "It came with the edict, sir," the clerk answered. The narrator rid the wax and saw a seal that did not match the city's standard. He leaned in, thumb lightly touching the curled edge of the parchment while his pen remained ready. Suspicion moved into doubt. "That seal is wrong," the clerk's eyes flicked to the crowd. The crowd leaned forward like a single body. Voices rose. Someone called for punishment. Someone else hissed that the magistrate must show firmness. A faction in the square wanted an example. The magistrate's mouth tightened. He made a slow, ritual hand gesture and set the parchment down as if to close debate. The narrator watched the movement and wrote its exact shape in the ledger. Thumb over forefinger, a quick outward sweep. The gesture was a signal. The magistrate's mannerisms showed a habitual recourse to ceremony when uncertain. The clerk then unfolded a second parchment and broke a wafer of red wax. He held it high so the sun could catch the stamp. "By council edict," the clerk announced, "an exemplary sentence is required to deter unrest." The narrator caught the words and underlined them. The seal on that edict matched the high chamber's mark. The narrator's suspicion shifted into a quiet fury. He flipped the ledger open and compared earlier entries. He traced ink stains where the clerk had adjusted letters in other sentences. He felt something tighten in his jaws and set his pen down faster than he had before. Doubt had become certainty. Someone had overruled local discretion. The witness mother, Anna Morales, moved closer again. She forced a voice out between sobs. "Magistrate, please." He stole bread to feed the baby. He confessed because he was frightened. "He is 12. The magistrate's voice did not change. "The edict stands." "The people require order." A bailiff shoved the mother back. "Anna," the narrator wrote, pleaded for clemency. He recorded the shove in a single clipped sentence. People in the crowd began to shout their support alternately for Anna and for the magistrate. The narrator's pen caught citizens' names when possible. He wrote down the sound of a vendor slamming a crate in anger. Details remained concrete. Bailiffs strapped the wooden yoke onto the child's neck. The wood scraped the thin hair at the base of his skull. The child tried to pull away. The bailiff tightened the straps with a leather thong until the child's small shoulders bowed. The clerk read aloud the specific method prescribed by the council edict. It named restraint, exposure, and a marking of shame. The narrator recorded the method in clinical terms: yoke placed, straps tightened, iron cuff loops set at adult spacing. The child inhaled and his chest hit the yoke with a small, frightened sound. The narrator watched those breaths and wrote the time. Someone in the crowd hissed, "For ordnance!" The crowd wanted spectacle. A group pressed forward and a baker began to chant. The narrator made a note that the baker, Thomas Delgado, had been loudest. In the pen margins he drew precise ticks next to names. The magistrate's voice turned toward the chant, and he smiled in a way the narrator recognized. It was a procedural smile, a practiced sign that the ritual was accomplishing its purpose. The narrator's suspicion slid into a brittle despair. The law was working as intended. A child in the crowd started to cry at the sight. The young victim turned his face away and clutched the wooden charm at his chest. The narrator recorded that the charm was a carved bird on a string. He watched the magistrate's eyes flick to the charm briefly, then away. The clerk stepped forward to produce a small blade. He had scissors used to tighten leather straps. "Hold him still," he said to a bailiff. The bailiff's hand closed over the child's shoulder. The magistrate's voice read the final lines on his parchment. He pronounced the sentence with ritual cadence while the sun pushed a thin, hard light across the scaffold. In the center of that public theater, the narrator found an opening. He approached the clerk as if to inquire about the seal again. His manner was professional, his face a practiced neutrality. Clerk, I need to cross, referenced the council edict with the registry. The clerk hesitated and then offered a small, clipped laugh. It is already recorded, sir. The narrator did not accept the laugh as proof. He, who delivered the edict, the clerk's lips tightened and he said, a courier from the high chamber. He left at sunrise. That detail mattered. The narrator wrote the courier's description down and lifted his head to scan the crowd for anyone who matched it. A man in a faded cloak slipped back into the market. The narrator saw the courier's hair tied with a thin red ribbon. He noted the ribbon and began to move toward the man. At the scaffold, the magistrate took a ceremonial hammer and struck a small wooden block 3 times, by counsel and by seal, he declared. The crowd surged. The narrator's motion halted. He felt fear move through his hands in a different way. Not the professional fear of error, but the fear of being shut out from truth. His emotion shifted again from suspicion to fear, from fear to a grim resolve to document the mechanical steps of wrongdoing. The bailiffs now enacted the prescribed procedure. They tightened cuffs until the child's skin reddened where metal met flesh. The wooden yoke dug into the collarbones. The clerk allowed the marking to be applied later. The child whimpered once, and then held his breath until his shoulders trembled. Anna Morales tried to push through again and was met with a fist to the mouth by a man called Bernardo, who had been among the angry faction. Stand back, Anna. Bernardo spat, breathing hard. Stand back or you will be charged too. Anna cuffed and spat blood in the dust. The narrator wrote what he saw. Bernardo's hand on her face, spit on cobbles, a merchant's cart rocking as someone pushed. The magistrate gave a set of ritual gestures that instructed the bailiffs to proceed to the irreversible part of the sentence. He pronounced the child's loss of civic status and ordered the marking. The narrator's face remained impassive, but his hands began to shake slightly as he wrote. He recorded the exact wording of the pronouncement. He made an effort to speak only when formalities required it. The magistrate, will the council provide witness signatures for the mark? The magistrate's answer was a single phrase. Recorded on the edict, the narrator underlined that phrase and made a vertical line beside it in the ledger. Halfway through the procedure, a clerk who had been fidgeting stepped forward with a folded scrap of paper. He thrust it toward the magistrate and whispered. The magistrate read and then paled minutely at the corner of his mouth. The narrator leaned forward. What is it? He asked. The clerk's voice was low. A petition, my lord. From the Harbour Guild. They claim the arson was part of a larger riot and ask that the sentence be strict to set an example. The magistrate's jaw closed. He nodded once. The narrator felt a small cliffhanger, a detail that might change the public's perception. He waited to see whether the magistrate would rescind or alter the sentence. Instead, the magistrate folded the petition into his inner robe and returned his attention to the scaffold. The civic order demands an example. A man in the crowd shouted, "Make him an example!" Another voice called, "Let him answer like a man!" The narrator recorded the shouts as separate entries. He observed the crowd's transformation from curiosity to hunger for retribution. He wrote the names of 2 men who led the chant, Tomas Delgado and Bernardo. Those names would matter later in the registry. The narrator's suspicion hardened into accusation by record. The bailiffs began the marking. They used a heated iron to brand a small mark on the child's shoulder, near the yoke line where flesh was already raw. The child's small body jerked with the first brand. He gasped and then stopped making sound, compressed by pain and fear. The narrator wrote the brand's description. A cross within a circle, roughly stamped, edges blackened by heat. He recorded the child's small hands tightening on the charm until the string cut into skin. The witness mother screamed and had to be lifted away by 2 women who pulled her screaming into the crowd's edge. At that moment, the narrator noticed a clerk in the magistrate's shadow reaching into his robe and producing a second, smaller seal. The clerk's hand closed around it, and he placed it on the ledger as if to legitimize the record. The narrator's pen moved faster. He who authorized the smaller seal. The clerk stammered, "I." It was instructed to be appended for clarity. The narrator's reaction shifted. The earlier doubt and fear channeled into a methodical hunt for trace. He marked the clerk's name repeatedly and recorded the time when the seal was applied. That seal would later betray the chain of command. The crowd's mood changed when the child's breathing grew shallow and irregular. People began to exchange looks. The baker, Thomas Delgado, who had chanted for punishment, now crossed his arms and looked hard at the magistrate. He realized what the ritual had done to a small body. Anna Morales pushed through the crowd and fell to her knees by the scaffold. Magistrate, stop. Anna, please, look at him. He is a child. The magistrate's eyes flicked once to Anna, then away. He kept his voice even. The law is the law, he said. Order is preserved. The narrator wrote both lines as they fell, keeping the punctuation that showed delivery. A sharp demand and a measured reply. A sudden twist changed how the public understood the entire event. A man in a merchant's coat shouted. He confessed under duress. We saw them in the cellar. Bailiffs struck him. The narrator's pen stopped. This claim referenced the cellar tribunal 2 weeks earlier, where bailiffs had taken the child, and where the narrator had recorded the transfer without noting the precise coercion he suspected. Now the claim injected a new cause into the square. The magistrate's face, which had been composed, lost something like color in an instant. The crowd fell into a brief, stunned hush as the accusation registered. The narrator's emotion shifted again. Initial suspicion had become focused indignation. Indignation now moved toward a determination to trace accountability. Voices broke into rapid exchange. Clerk, the man shouted, where are the witnesses from the cellar? Bring the bailiffs forward. Someone demanded. Bernardo, the man who had struck Anna, pushed toward the magistrate's bench. If he lied under beatings, then the sentence is void, the magistrate answered. Order! Order! But his command wavered. A short argument erupted at the bench with 3 to 5 quick exchanges between Bernardo, the magistrate, and the clerk. Bernardo accused the bailiffs. The clerk defended the documents. The magistrate demanded order. The narrator captured each short line with names attached. Bernardo, magistrate, clerk. The crowd watched the exchange like an instrument tuning itself. The magistrate looked at his bailiffs and then at the crowd. He made a choice under pressure. He announced that the procedure would continue, but that the council would order an inquiry into the cellar's conduct. The narrator recorded the magistrate's conditional phrase exactly. The crowd reacted with mixed shouts. Anna Morales cried out that the inquiry would come too late. Bernardo spat and called the magistrate a coward. The narrator put those words into the ledger as evidence of public division. He also recorded the magistrate's faint hand tremor when he folded his parchments. The final act played out like a machine. The bailiffs tightened the last straps. The child's limbs ceased to resist. The brand ended with a final, soft sound and then a long, low quiet as the market swallowed the noise. The magistrate pronounced the sentence complete. The narrator closed his ledger with a deliberate motion and set the brass-rimmed spectacles on the page. He watched the magistrate gather parchments and tuck them into the inner robe. He watched Anna lifted and carried away by women who murmured prayers. He closed the ledger and made a final entry. Time, method, names of officials present, description of the edict seal, and witness statements by name. After the crowd thinned, the narrator walked to the scaffold's edge and crouched beside the child's small form. The child opened his eyes briefly and whispered, "Mama." The narrator noted the word. He recorded the child's breath patterns, the small tremor in his lips, and the way his fingers curled around the carved bird charm. He wrote the precise placement of the brand and the red lines already forming. The magistrate's shadow fell across the pupil's face as the magistrate turned to leave. The narrator rose and said nothing, but closed the ledger with a sound that was more than a click. It was a small percussion that marked the end of an event. In the days that followed, the registry showed the ledger entry and the appended small seal. The narrator cross-referenced earlier passages he had written. The harbor incident, the cellar tribunal. He compared handwriting in margins and found the clerk's ink thicker on pages matched to the edict. He for the courier's manifest and learned the courier had been accompanied by 2 men from the chamber who did not appear on the official roster. The narrator stared at the manifest and then at the folded parchment again. He wrote an additional line in the ledger. A possible external pressure. Anna Morales visited the registry the next morning with a woman named Lucia who had been at the dock the day of the harbor incident. Lucia testified that the bailiffs had pushed the child down the rope in order to make him appear guilty. Her testimony contradicted the official record. The narrator recorded Lucia's full words in his neat script. He wrote Lucia's full name and the time she spoke. The magistrate called for a short hearing and summoned Bernardo to explain why he had struck Anna. Bernardo claimed he acted to preserve order. The magistrate accepted Bernardo's explanation and thanked him. The narrator noted the magistrate's gratitude as part of the record. The council inquiry that the magistrate had promised arrived in the form of a second mandate, a delegation from the High Chamber. They inspected the ledger, the seals, and took sworn statements. They the narrator to read his entries aloud. He did so with even cadence. He read the precise moments. The clerk's application of the small seal, the petition from the Harbour Guild, the courier with the red ribbon. The delegation listened and then took the ledger to be examined in the High Chamber's official office. The narrator felt a cold sense of duty relief and then return. He had done what he could. He had written what he had seen. Weeks later, the council published a terse announcement. The sentence had been validated, but the manner of interrogation in the cellar would be investigated. The narrator read the announcement and marked it in the ledger with a small cross. Anna's petition for clemency was denied. Bernardo was not charged for striking Anna. Tomas Delgado, the baker, resigned his place at the head of the faction and took to staying home. Lucia's testimony was logged but did not overturn the marks. The narrator's entries remained as the most precise public trace of the sequence. He felt a sense of closure in his duty, but not an emotional resolution. He set the ledger on the bench and ran his fingers along the worn binding. Months later, the child appeared in another registry as an orphaned laborer with a scarred shoulder. The narrator visited the yard where children were apprenticed and saw the small carved bird caught by a string on a peg in the corner of a common room. He went to the magistrate's bench one last time and watched the magistrate sign a minor ordinance about market stalls. The magistrate's hands were steady again. The narrator recorded the signature and the time. He then closed his ledger and left a final note. Names remembered, instruments catalogue, and the wooden toy left on the scaffold stones as an item to keep in memory. The chapter ended with a concrete event rather than an abstract moral. The magistrate gathered his parchments, folded them into his robe, and left the square with his signet ring catching the light. The narrator closed the ledger and walked to the spot where the wooden toy lay. He picked it up, noted the child's blood smudge on its paint, and placed the toy inside the ledger's back cover as an object of record. He did not write a moral. He wrote the object's weight and color and the way the paint flaked where fingers had gripped it. The final line in the ledger read, Toy Catalogue, Anna Morales witness clerk's seal recorded. Counsel to inquire into cellar methods. The narrator left the market with his spectacles tucked in his coat and the ledger under his arm. He had moved from suspicion to proof to a grim tally. He had watched civic ritual turn youth into an example. He had recorded names, gestures, and the sequence of choices that ended a childhood. The ledger closed on a factual beat. The magistrate's departure and the toy stored among the records. That was the end of the market's episode. The registry, the seals, and the names remained as the only enduring traces of the event. In that same town, the dock still smelled of salt and rope. In the cellar, the lanterns still cut the cobbles into bright lines. The narrator kept those images in his ledger as entries, not as metaphors. He kept writing because the record resisted forgetting. He recorded the exact words the magistrate had spoken and the small gestures that made the law feel inevitable. He left the reader with a single concrete remnant. The carved bird toy tucked into the ledger, its paint still warm from the day's sun.